Hello.
Hi, Grace. How are you?
Hi, Kristen. I'm doing fine. How's it over going with you?
Everything's great. Everything's great. I'm so excited. See all the people here tonight and everything we're going to talk about. So I'm like thrilled.
Yeah, I think people are just trickling in. So hopefully, I know we're a little shy of 6 o'clock. So my clock just turned to 6 Pacific time, which I know you're in Mountain time, so it's 7 o'clock for you.
7. Yep.
Yeah, and then for our friends in the other time zones, welcome as well, because I know it might be a little bit later for our East Coasters, and I don't think we have any on the East Coast. So I think 9 o'clock, trying to do the math here.
9
I always
o'clock.
use my
Yeah.
fingers.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
Okay, well, since we are official at 6 o'clock, I'm just going to go ahead and say welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us at our first ever Quest Talks. I'm Grace New. I work here over at Quest Nutrition. And today we have joining us our resident registered dietitian for Quest is Kristin Kirkpatrick. She's totally awesome. She's full of knowledge, great insights, lots of stuff we want to share with everyone here. But tonight, the topic is nutritional psychology, which I find very interesting. I love the idea of food and your mood. So tonight, she's going to tell us a little bit about what nutritional psychology is, why is it important, and also how do we navigate food and mood. So Kristen, I'm going to throw it to you to please intro yourself a little bit and also then jump into telling us what we're learning tonight.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Grace. So I'm Kristin Kirkpatrick. I'm so honored and thrilled to be here and honored that you're taking your time out of your night or late afternoon to join me as well. I've been a dietitian, a registered dietitian for over 20 years. I actually can't believe that when I say that. I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm getting old, but over 20 years. I've spent my entire career at Cleveland Clinic. So I have worked my entire career in integrative and lifestyle medicine. So at the Cleveland Clinic, we used to be the Wellness Institute, and then we splintered off into integrative and lifestyle. But the fact of the matter is we have always been a very holistic side of nutrition. I was so excited when I had this opportunity to talk about nutritional psychology because I thought back about my intro and I went back, Grace, to my schooling when I was in dietetic school. And everything was physical health, physical health, physical health, right? We were learning how to help the person who wanted to lose weight or the person who had cancer or the cardiac patient or how to feed a patient in the hospital setting. But there was no attention to well-being and mental health and happiness. So I think sometimes it's kind of like the missing puzzle that we talk about dietary patterns and what makes sense, but sometimes we don't talk about, well, what dietary pattern makes us happy? So it's a question I ask my patients all the time, actually.
Yeah, and there's a lot of talk about the physical aspect of how that improves your mood. And we all know that, like, go get some fresh air, go for a walk, like get some movement in your body, get some energy going. But then we forget there is something that we do all the time in order to survive. And that also has its effect on us too. And that's why I'm excited for you to share it with you, because we just forget about, like, because we just think we eat.
Right.
And that's it. But we also don't think about that you are what you eat, and what you eat affects you.
Yep. Yeah. I think it's a really good point you bring up, because the other component of eating is, I kind of joke to my patients, but I think it's true. And I think anyone that has lived on this earth and eats, which is everyone that is watching this and me and you, we all know this to be true, that the eating is one thing, the process of eating, but what we choose to eat and our emotions associated with it, or even the environmental aspect of why we chose to eat something at any given time, there are so many factors. Whether or not we slept well the night before can have an effect of our energy and our hunger levels the next day. So I think, like, we all have to eat. We have this biological need to eat for survival. And we, to your point, Grace, we can choose not to exercise. We can choose not to manage stress, but we can't choose not to eat. So we're kind of forced into this area of survival, but we have to make the decisions that make sense for us. And I think when I look at my patients and I think about all the people that I've counseled, the one thing I think people get wrong is that they think that in order to follow a dietary pattern of any kind, it's got to be stringent or it's got to be very specific. And people aren't really open to taking pieces and parts of different diets and looking at how that fits within their own personal preferences. So I think we have to kind of tie that in as well. There's so much complexity to our eating habits and sociology behind it as well.
Yeah, and for nutritional psychology, that's kind of a new area, or has it been around for a long time?
Yeah, it's definitely an evolving area of science. So I would say that it's not concrete by any means yet. We need more studies. I would feel more comfortable if 10, 20 years from now, we have a lot more studies and we can talk a lot better about it and the data. But we do have some data since 2015. And just to give a synopsis of the definition that we have for it, nutritional psychology is basically the intersection between behavioral science and nutritional science. So how do those two things come together? How do we look at good mood and relate it to our diet? And we can really look at it in a bidirectional type of manner. So we can say when our mood is good, we might be more likely to eat healthy. We're feeling good. We're feeling like we want to make healthy decisions. And by the way, that term healthy is very subjective. Everyone has different definitions of healthy, right? But the other thing is when we're not feeling great, sometimes we make choices that might not be the best, but we are eating certain foods because of those choices. We all have stories, like I'm sure you have a story of why you got into your profession. I would love to hear it. I have a story too, but we all have stories of why we got to where we did. And mine really evolved from starting working with a dietitian because I was making all the wrong choices. I was really eating emotionally. And I wasn't able to identify that. So I have a real interest in this topic.
Yeah, and mine was because I started working and it was in a very hectic, high stress environment. And like any normal 20-year-old who's just out of college, like you're striving to do your best and you're just eating when you can. Like,
right.
It's not, you're supposed to eat at these more set times. Like that's better for your body, but it doesn't work when you have the conflict of trying to meet deadlines. And so I was like working all these hours, late nights, and I would eat whatever was available, like grab something on the go that was fast and easy. And then I found myself not feeling well, like every time after I ate, especially after lunch. And then I went to the doctor because I started having these aches and pains. And I was convinced I had like fibromyalgia or something like that. And they thought maybe I had rheumatoid arthritis based off of what I was telling them my symptoms were. I had rosacea. I looked like crap. I felt it. And then, and then all of a sudden I was just like, I think I need to change something because they can't figure out what's wrong. Everything came out inconclusive. I didn't want to have them say I had lupus or anything like that. Sure. But that was something that they thought they wanted to keep an eye on me for. And like my autoimmune system, there was like issues with that. And so then I started to just clean up a little bit. Like I started bringing my own lunch. That's what happened. And then I noticed that the rosacea went away and I was feeling better. And I think it came down to, I was just keeping myself in like inflammation, like constant inflammation. And I think that was caused by food.
Yeah.
And that affected the way how I worked and how I thought and, my mood as well. So that's what I wanted to ask you about a little bit more is the correlation there and how your patients, they come with you with the same issues and, how do you help them with it?
Yeah, I think the inflammation piece is so critical. And I think it's a great way to look at this whole topic very high level. So if we just look at any disease state, every disease state starts somewhere in the body with inflammation, right? Regardless of what it is, somewhere inflammation occurred. And there's varying degrees of inflammation and also varying reasons why the inflammation occurs. But inflammation is always there in any kind of chronic condition. And we can look at mental health, adverse mental health outcomes as chronic conditions as well in certain populations. So the inflammation's there. So if we then look at this intersection of behavioral health and we think about inflammation, when I am presenting at behavioral health conferences, a lot of times I will start my presentation with all the studies that are relatable to brain inflammation. And sometimes it's just relatable to things like dementia or Alzheimer's, or just looking at inflammatory things that occur in the brain that might impact memory. And the reason I start with that is because anything that might touch inflammation from the brain perspective could touch mood, because our mood is so highly determined by our brain, our guts, the communication between the two. So I think that really we could stop here and just say, you know what, everybody, if you are following an anti-inflammatory diet, and let's define that, it's probably going to be really good for you in terms of overall mood, hopefully, right? Now, there's a lot of things that are really involved in some of these issues, of course. And diet is not the cure. I want to make that really clear, that diet is never the cause or the cure of any kind of adverse mental health outcome. But we do know that it could impact it based on some of the studies. So I think, like, let's just focus there, right? How do we get inflammation to kind of quiet the flames? Tame the flames is a term that I use in my patient population. And that really looks at really adding in foods that make sense, that have a lot of nutrient density. There's very specific nutrients that we've seen in some of the research that we can talk about. But that's really where I start. I start with inflammation. So I'm glad you brought that up, because clearly that was what was going on with you.
Yeah. And so then, and then there's certain foods I know that could help with that. I mean, there's the basic ones that you always hear about, like turmeric. That's like the main one I could think of. I guess there's other cooling foods that might be good for you. And, but to your point, like, I think it definitely affected. I was like crabby. I was irritable. I was annoyed. I mean, I think I did something with my hormones too, I'm sure. Like, I thought I was constantly like PMSing, right? It's not the way that's not the way to live.
Right.
So I do feel that there was a lot to do with, you know, when you are able to prepare, like the food prep aspect, you know, your meal prepping, and, you know, coming up with a plan like that. Really did kind of, I want to say, like, balance me and even me out. I wasn't so high, and like, it wasn't so the drama, everything with I had like really high highs and really low lows. I don't know if you can speak a little bit to that, about, you know, what else people can do to help, you know, navigate and balance.
Yeah, especially when I hear about the highs and lows, I think about two different things. I think about hormonal health. So that's the first. So hormone health is one thing. And I see that a lot, because a lot of my patients are females, and they're usually about, you know, sometimes they're 30 plus or 35 plus. So I see a lot of that coming in. But also I think about the role that sugar plays in balance, right? So one of the things that I tell my patients is that anytime you have a carbohydrate of any kind, you want there to be competition for digestion. And I'll tell you what that means. So I remember when I was a kid and I was like overweight, obese, I was seeing a dietitian, I would go to the movie theater and I would get like a king size bag of licorice, like king size, right? And I would eat that, and my blood sugar would just go through the roof, and then it would drop. And it would drop, I would get the shakes. There was this cycle of, I feel great. It's just, I'm feeling like I'm on cloud nine. And then all of a sudden I'm feeling shaky. I need more licorice. I just kept needing more and more and more and more. So that's one thing that I notice in my patient population. When people start adding foods that have more protein, that have more fiber, they create competition for digestion. So the body is no longer looking at that licorice and saying, hey, this is great, we're going to have a sugar party. Instead, it's, okay, we've got this carbohydrate, but we also have fiber, we also have protein, we also have fat, and I got to break down all of this. So all of that breaks down in such a way where the absorption of sugar into the bloodstream is a lot less. So I always say, instead of the spike and low, there's a hump. And so that is competition for digestion. So when I work with people that come to me because they just can't stop eating sugar, and by the way, those are the most difficult patients, because they're so challenged with wanting to go back to old habits. They don't feel like they don't have alternatives sometimes, and they have these cravings and things like that. But when I see that, sometimes adding in more nutrient density helps them a little bit more even keel, and that ultimately helps their mood and their overall well-being.
So I know, like you mentioned about the sugar crash and coming down from it. So that makes people crabby. right? And then you become more irritable than you were before. But then you're saying, what was it? The competition for digestion.
Competition for digestion.
So,
Yeah.
so then I guess if I were to eat certain foods, it's your point, there should be protein and fiber, but I could still probably have some of that sugar or carbs because bread is so good, like all that stuff. So I'll eat it together. It'll be more, I won't get that highs and the lows as much, and then I'll feel less crabby and probably feel better about myself.
Yeah, because of the fact that your blood sugar won't be experiencing the spikes and the lows. The spikes feel great. There's no doubt about it. I mean, we don't eat things without benefit. So the spikes serve our purpose, but it's a very temporary purpose. And like you said, you felt like crap. It's impossible to get the spike without feeling like crap. So whatever high we get, there's always going to be a low because there's nothing to sustain it. Which is why when you look at sugar consumption, it is very much a cycle. So we have the craving. We have the craving for something like sugar. Let's just use the licorice as an example. So we've got the craving for something. We eat that. Once we eat that, our blood sugar or insulin goes up. We have some endorphins that might go up. It just depends on what the sugar is. Then that crashes down. Once that crashes down, we need it back again because we got to get back to that high. So that's really and yes, your mood can be really impacted. I mean, have you ever met someone who's on top of the world and happy when their blood sugar is in the tank? I haven't, right? So
I think that's where hangry comes in.
It's very hangry. That's very hangry scenario, right? So I think that's one thing to think about. And it's also a way that we can increase nutrient density. So you had been talking about you mentioned turmeric, for example. And turmeric, if you look at the curcumin, you look at the compounds that are found in turmeric, other herbs, oregano is another one. You look at flavonoid consumption. There's very clear associations with some of these foods and helping with potentially reducing inflammation levels. Now, we don't know unless you're in a study whether or not that's occurring or whether, you might go get tested for that. But that's one way that we can see that mood can be impacted because of some of those choices. And then I always like to say to my patients, I don't like to call food good or bad, but we have to recognize that certain foods will help us on our health journey. And that health journey includes happiness. And certain foods will be a little bit of a wall. There will be that wall standing there for us to be able to get there. It will make it more difficult. So that's the way I look at it.
Okay, so I know that there's more to it, but it's gonna be a little bit quick and dirty kind of question that I have for you. So let's say I'm not feeling that great, right now. I don't know why. Let's just say I'm just something just bothering me, maybe it's stress or something. And if I want to, is there something I could do that could possibly help me pick up my mood a little bit? I don't you mentioned flavonoids, and I know there's also fancy words like polyphenols and everything. I mean, I just hear them thrown around. Sometimes I remember what they mean, sometimes I don't.
Right.
I know look for things with color, right?
Yeah.
Color. So I don't, there's a little, maybe you have a couple tips that might help me if I'm just happen to be in a midday slump somewhere and I just need a little bit of pick me up to get my mood going again.
Sure, absolutely. Well, and this is something that that I've actually done with patients. We've done kind of these dietary behavioral assessments. Now, these are always done in conjunction and with a therapist, a psychotherapist, a psychologist, or a psychiatrist. So I think that's one thing that I want people to take away from is that if this is something you're interested in, then it's the joint team that's going to be most effective. The dietitian alone will not be anywhere near as effective as the dietitian therapist team. So that is that's my team. We work together, but we do some of these assessments. So we would do this assessment and say, well, what are some of the things that we see in your diet that might be hindering a little bit more of well-being or a little bit more happiness, right? If we were to use those terms. So we would look at that first, right? And then we would also look at things like sleep. We would look at your stress management, whether you're managing stress, because just like we said at the beginning of this chat, the food is one component, but there's so many things that impact it, right? There's so many things. For a midday slump, I think there's so many studies that we see that are associating fruits and vegetables, and fruits are just so easy to kind of just bring with you when you're at work, or bring with you when you're in the car, whatever it may be. For my patients, if they're going to have fruit, I tend to focus on things that are lower on what we call the glycemic load. So those are things that are not going to have this huge spike in blood sugar. And they act a little bit differently than things higher on the glycemic load. So berries, apples, pears, stone fruits, those would all be things a little bit lower. So, maybe looking at, okay, if I'm having a pretzel for a snack, swapping that for an apple. Two totally different foods in terms of what we see in the data and what that might do to help improve mood. So that might be kind of step one. Even looking at the bioavailability and some of the polyphenol content and all of that related to something like having a cup of coffee, like that can be really beneficial. So again, like sometimes just going back to plants, which are super high in nutrient density, whether it's polyphenols, whether that's phytonutrients, flavonoids. The end of the day, it's looking at antioxidant capacity. And anytime we have more antioxidants, we have associations within the data that our mood may be improved.
Yeah. And then I know that we talk about the gut, right? And then this the talk about gut health, and the association I've been hearing a lot lately is about how your stomach is like your second brain, and how that affects, because I think you mentioned earlier about inflammation of the brain, and anything like that obviously affects who you are and what's going on. And then, so I wanted to touch a little bit about the gut-mind connection and how that plays in, because obviously when you eat, the food goes to your gut, and then that must translate somewhere to sending signals to your brain too.
Right. And that's exactly it. So it is the signals that are occurring. There's constant communication between the brain and the gut. The other thing I like to remind people is that 90% of our serotonin, which is one of our feel-good hormones, lives in the gut. So like our feel-good hormone lives within our gut. And it seems so, I guess, rational in some ways, but then it's almost like, well, is that really the connection? But when you feel stressed, when I think about when you have a really stressful moment and you feel it in your gut, I always tell people that that's a great sign of how powerful our gut is in determining like the physical symptoms that could manifest. We also know people with gut conditions, so like inflammatory bowel disease, things like that, they are more likely, based on some of the studies, to have some mental distress. And it makes sense, right? They could be in pain, or they could have symptoms, or there could be some social issues going on, things like that. So I think from the gut-brain direction, we've got something called the vagus nerve. And so all of the communication goes from the gut up to the brain and back. But what we are seeing in some of the science is that there seems to be more messaging that originates in the gut that ends up in the brain versus originates in the brain and ends up in the gut. So this is why we are calling the brain the second, or the gut the second brain, because there's so much communication between the two. And again, if we take it to the next level and say behavioral sciences really does focus on brain health at its highest level, then we have to understand that the gut and the brain are connected in some way. Again, evolving research. Nutritional psychology research really started coming out in 2015. So we are really, truly in the infancy of it. I mean, think how long we've had studies on the Mediterranean diet, for example. So this is still new, and there's still a lot to learn, but it is very clear that there is some sort of connection going on between the gut health and the brain.
Yeah, no, thank you.
And then the things we can do to improve gut health. I mean, we could talk for hours about that.
Yeah, I mean, I know we still have a little bit of time. So, Kristin, I don't know if you have other tips that you want to talk about. Like, I know you have your own experience. I had my experience. I'm sure other people have their experience as well. I just didn't know if there's anything that you might want people to take away if they are having some issues and they're thinking, hey, maybe it's the food I'm eating. How do they know? How do they tell? What can they do?
Yeah, sure. So I can talk about what we see in terms of the research, in terms of some foods that are associated with worsening mood and improvements in mood. So we can start with the good, which is potential improvements in mood. A lot of the studies that we've seen, we already talked about fruits and vegetables. So fruit and vegetable consumption can be, of course, one of them. And so making sure you're getting those servings. I oftentimes will have my patients come to me and say like, there's no way I can eat like 7 vegetables. Like, who has that kind of time? But then I think that people don't realize that a serving of a vegetable is a handful. So it's quite easy to get 7 of them. It's not that hard. And you were asking earlier for like a quick tip. So one of the tips I give to people is just consider getting 5 to 7 colors in every day. 5 to 7 colors, different colors. That would be a huge step in the right direction because you're getting some of those foods. Foods that are high in folate. So we do know there's an association between folate-rich foods. So looking at beans, lentils, spinach, and what the association is with better mood. So there is some evidence that when you have folate deficiency, that could impact your mood. So there's that association. We have a lot of data on omega-3 fatty acids, especially the marine-based forms. So looking at wild fatty fish or looking at fish oil supplementation. We've seen both in the studies. Most of this is boiling down to a Mediterranean approach that always has some sort of fish oil in it. We've also seen associations with vitamin D. So I tell my patients, get your vitamin D checked. Don't just assume you're deficient or assume you're fine because you're in the sun in an adequate amount of time. Get it checked so you know what your levels are. So those are some of the things we are constantly seeing in more of the specifics under a Mediterranean approach. If we were to talk about foods that we can see based on maybe more negative aspects of how mood can be impacted, fast food tends to be something that we see a lot of. So looking at fast food consumption, consumption of sugar. So sugar is a huge culprit. I mean, anytime I present, I could spend 30 minutes just talking about sugar and really refined carbohydrates. So anything that is going to spike that blood sugar without that competition. So sugar, refined carbohydrates, fast food. I think one of the things people can think about is if someone is seeing someone for any kind of mental health condition or they're considering it, just take a snapshot into your kitchen. Look in your pantry, look in your fridge, and just kind of ask yourself, like, where do I have color? Where do I have nutrient density? Where am I getting protein, fiber, etc.? Those are all things that I think people can ask themselves as a first step. And then, of course, it's a whole journey after that.
Yeah, and that actually sounds like kind of an easy first step to do is like you said, walk into your kitchen, look at your pantry, and just assess what's nutrient dense, which would be like your point, the proteins, the fiber, just like looking at the vitamins and minerals that you need to take and stuff.
Right.
And then if you see anything that might not be nutrient dense, maybe just not eat it for a little bit and see how you feel.
Right.
And that's when we test it out.
Do your own experiment. I mean, when we look at studies in nutritional psychology, a lot of them are, they're short in nature, about 12 weeks. Some of them are longer, but some of them are 3 weeks. And, there's potential benefits in mood, even in a 3-week period of kind of cleaning up the diet a little bit. I think we can also look at gut health. I think the gut health is really important. And so we can look at this concept of prebiotics and probiotics. Prebiotics are non-digestible fibers. So we find them in bananas, Jerusalem artichoke. We find them in the allium family, which is like leeks, garlic, shallots. And so they literally resist digestion. They go stomach, they go into the small intestine, no digestion is occurring. And then they go into large intestine where they are fermented. And then they essentially become food for probiotics. So prebiotics are really important. And probiotics, of course, are found in fermented foods, foods with live active cultures. But what I always say, like I like to give analogies, which is why I say like just have some color throughout the day, have 5 or 6 colors. But I always tell people, like, when we think about our microbiome, like imagine a battlefield and you've got the good gut microbes and you got the bad. The winner of the war is going to be the one that has the most soldiers. So you always want to feed the soldiers on the right side. And what feeds the soldiers on the bad side, what we see in some of the studies, is sugar. That's one component. So if you have a lot of sugar, you're going to build up that army of bad microbes. If you take sugar down from the diet, refined carbs, you take more plants, you do those fermented foods, you're going to build up the army that is on the good side. So we want to continually build up that army, and we want to go with a concept that is referred to as microbial diversity. So that means getting a variety of different foods, different nutrients to help our microbes really flourish and thrive.
Yeah, and like they say, variety is good to have. And to your point, like your body, I think, gets used to one of the same thing too much. So it's nice to have diversity in that aspect. We are close at there. We're very close to time. So I know there's probably a lot more. I know you and I could talk forever because, we both love talking about how the body affects us and what we can do to help ourselves and, have the tips and tricks and stuff. I always ask you, like, what can I do to like help myself to feel better? So I know that we had just dropped into the chat your Facebook, your Instagram, and also an email. So if anyone here has any other questions, to go a little bit more in depth and learn more, or just have regular questions about just even off this topic, which is totally fine, please feel free to reach out to Kristin. I think it's Kristin at KristinKirkpatrick.com. And your Facebook and your IG handle is Fuel Well with Chrissy.
Yeah.
Krissy.
Yes, fuel well, like feel well.
Feel well, yeah.
Yes, that's why.
I love it. I love it. I don't know if you have any other parting words for anyone who's still, might be interested in this topic. I think we covered most of the stuff we wanted to talk about today. I don't know if I might have missed a couple things.
Yeah, I think we covered like the good high level. I think one of the things I'd say is like, I always tell my patients, don't forget to be normal. If you have a cookie every once in a while, or you're having something every once in a while, that is not what we see in the data that contributes to worsening mental health. It's when that becomes a regular part of your diet. So like, we also have to look at our mental health and our happiness. And I learned this from the therapists that I've worked with, right? Like they've just given me so much knowledge, but we also have to look at like, what are the dietary patterns that make us happy? And if having a piece of pizza every once in a while makes us happy, then that's fine. It's when we have it in moderate amounts that it's not going to impact us as much. So let's remember the normalcy. We don't have to be perfect. We always want to strive for progress and not perfection. But I think it's good for us to recognize that if you are struggling with any kind of mental health, even if it's you just feel kind of sad, you just feel a little different, whatever the case may be, to really seek out therapy where they might have practices that are also working in conjunction with the dietitian. I think it is the wave of the future, hopefully, and that can really cover both the dietary aspect and then the very important part of the counseling aspect.
Thank you. This is great information. Like I learned a couple things today, The other thing I wanted to bring up is we hope to have more of these Quest Talks with you. And to all of our amazing audience members out there, we hope to have something coming out soon, a little bit of a schedule. So stay tuned and, just keep, tuning into our Quest Talks, and hopefully you'll learn a little bit more about your health and our well-being here and be on a quest.
That's right. That's right. Thank you, Grace.
All right. No, thank you. Thank you, Kristin. I'll talk to you later. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks for joining.